the San Francisco Experience podcast. Brought to you by Jim Herlihy. Independent commentary from a Silicon Valley perspective for a global audience, featuring newsmakers, thought leaders, and authors. Season 28, Episode 11. Does eliminating cash bail cause violent crime to go up or down? Talking with Ken Good, noted bail attorney. Bail reform is a contentious issue which impacts the criminal justice. There are jurisdictions around the country where bail reform has been implemented and studies which support or critique such reforms. Where do we stand as a nation as the debate about cash bail heats up? Are we heading to a uniform cashless bail system nationwide? There are up to 10 states that have already gone cashless. Or will individual states and cities decide to retain cash bail? And where does the judiciary stand on this issue? Ken Good serves as board member of the Professional Bondsmen of Texas. He'll help us navigate this complex issue. Hello, Ken, and thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
My pleasure. Ken, please take a moment to tell us about your practice as a bail attorney in Texas.
Well, I represent bondsmen and insurance companies, sureties across the state in licensing and on issues when they get into trouble or they have questions. I'm there to answer those questions. But also, I've got involved in this federal litigation, raising issues about whether bail is constitutional. Recently we heard that we're going to have to change the way we do bail because the current system's not constitutional. So when they started filing litigation on that, I got involved with that to become very knowledgeable and to try to become a resource for people on those issues, legislators and other attorneys. And I've written many articles now because many of the arguments you hear about the way the cases are being considered is not true. It's actually most of the time the court ruling is the opposite of what we hear on the news because the courts have held cash bail is constitutional. And so whenever we hear, it's going to be held unconstitutional, it's already been ruled on. And the biggest problem is there's no alternative that has the track record of the private bail system. So that's the reason why we're having all this craziness, all this turmoil, all this increasing crime is because there's no alternative to the cash bail system that has the same results.
Ken, could you give us a brief overview of the history of cash bail? How did we come to the point where we have cash bail?
Well, cash bail is kind of a term that can mean many different things. And so when to be real precise, I would say, how did the private surety bail system come to where it is? Because, cash bail can mean you're just posting cash instead of a private surety bond.
Right.
But how did the private surety bail system arise? It really is part of the common law that came with us all the way from England when people came to, the Americas, the 1700s. So it was part of the common law that they brought with them. And there was an early version in the United States on bail that you were someone's surety and they didn't show up for court, you took their place. And then we changed from that to where we made it a monetary amount, where we are guaranteeing someone's appearance in court. And if they don't appear, then we pay the court a sum of money instead of replacing the person with the surety.
I see. Give us a brief overview of the pros and cons of cash bail, and why are we talking about eliminating cash bail at this point? Again, many of our listeners may not be familiar with all the ins and outs of cash bail. Obviously, you are. This is your business. But please take a moment to explain to our listeners why cash bail has become such a contentious issue.
Well, I think the reality of why cash bail or the private surety bail system is under attack is it's an easy target. We've gone through periods in our past where we've talked about changing the private surety bail system. And the reason why it has never been changed, the reason why we've continued to use it over 200 years is because there's nothing else that has the same type of success. I mean, when you've got one system that has a less than 10% failure to appear rate.
Mm-hmm.
So 90% of the time or better, the private surety bail system gets their people to court.
Mm-hmm.
When you have any other alternative that has at least a 50% failure to appear rate or 80% failure to appear rate, well, that means all of those criminal cases have to be put on hold because you can't go forward with the criminal case until the defendant is standing before the court, except for very limited situations. So we keep trying new things and they keep creating chaos. Chaos creates, you can't hold anybody accountable. And then that creates de facto decriminalization, which is exactly what we're experiencing now in our inner cities where they're pushing these policies. And then it's become a very political issue. And so if you're on one side of the political spectrum, you have to support changing cash bail, even if all the studies, and I would say they are all showing that the very people that they say they're helping, those are the people that they're actually hurting, those societies. Because they're saying, oh, we have too many people of a certain race in our jail, so we're going to favor them for a while. Well, those communities are the ones that are having a dramatic increase in crime because by the most part, we commit crime in the same racial communities that we find ourselves living in.
Of course. Of course. Now, tell us, what are the pros and the cons? Of course, there are 8 or 9 states at this point which have moved to cashless bail. I happen to live in one of them, California. Tell us how these other states why they adopted cashless bail, and what do the studies show in those states as regards the administration of justice?
Well, I would say, what's the you asked earlier, what's the pros of the private surety bail system? Well, I mean, the private surety bail system does one thing, it does it really well. It gets people to go to court, and it gets them there because they're guaranteeing that they're going to pay the court an amount of money if they don't get them there. So the pros are we get people to go to court, we get them to go to court in the most successful way of any release mechanism currently being used.
Mhm.
And so cases get resolved quicker. We get justice to victims. I don't really see any cons from the private surety bail system. What one party would argue, because it's just become a political issue.
Right.
They're like, well, we have too many people of a certain race in the jail. We have too many people of a certain race in the prison system, and so we have to. And they're blaming that on the private surety bail system where we've changed, and I would disagree. I don't think California's got rid of it, of the private surety bail system. I think they've limited it,
Right.
but it still exists and it's still being used for the most violent offenses. But the problem is when they're limiting it, they're finding dramatically bad consequences, and it's because here's the best example I have: the federal system 20 years ago changed, and its system, and at the time it was holding 25% of the people that were arrested, they were holding them pretrial until their case was resolved. Well, so they made major reforms with the intent of lowering that, and it was simple. They started using the simple release mechanism. Well, over time, they found that so many people were not going to court that they have raised the percentage of the people that they are holding pretrial until their case resolves. So currently, the federal system is holding almost 75% of the people who are arrested pre-trial in jail until their case is resolved. The states can't afford to hold 75% of the people that are arrested. We just don't have the jail capacity to do that.
Right.
And so we have to make a decision as a society. Are we just going to give up on people coming to court, which means we're giving up on crime? I mean, until we have an alternative to the private surety bail system, we can't give up on using it. I would argue that some of these states that you're saying that have gotten rid of it, they have started rolling back these reforms and strengthening their reliance on the private surety bail system because of the very things that we talked about. I mean, the Yolo County, they kept all their data during COVID, and they released it, found that they compared someone released on a private surety bail bond versus somebody released on the simple release mechanism, which just is a promise that they're going to come back. It's nothing more than a promise.
Mm-hmm.
And the DA found that there was a 200% greater chance that someone released on a simple release mechanism would commit a new violent offense in the next 18 months versus someone released on a private surety bond. That is awful numbers just on the type of release mechanism you're using for your courts.
Just for the benefit of our listeners, Yolo County that Ken referenced is a largely suburban small town county west of Sacramento. Sacramento, of course, is the capital of California, and Yolo County is just west of Sacramento, and it includes the towns of Davis, where there's a large university, West Sacramento, and Woodlands. So not inner city urban, but medium-sized city urban.
Yeah, but the data that the DA's office there maintained during COVID and then released, this stuff that I'm talking about was quoted in the California legislature when they were talking about coming back and trying to get rid of the private surety bail system statewide. And ultimately, the bill didn't go anywhere, in part because of this data.
Mm-hmm. Now, you also referenced a study that was done by Drexel University back in New Jersey. What were those findings, Ken?
I find it interesting that we're saying, whether it is increasing crime or lowering crime when we pick the type of release mechanism. Even the Drexel study does not even argue that it's lowering crime. It says it has no impact, but I find it interesting because there's like 4 or 5 years worth of stuff, but they only looked at 2 and they started. I would say that whenever they're saying it didn't impact crime, they're playing fast and loose with the numbers. They're only looking at one specific kind of crime with guns. And so they didn't look at all crime. And all they got was it didn't make any difference. And so they're not even arguing slower crime.
Now tell me, with these varying policies around the country, California does one thing with regard to cash bail, and Texas does something else. There was a time until pretty recently where cash bail was the norm throughout the country, through all 50 states. And it's only been in the last few years that we've had this phenomenon of cashless bail in a number of our states and cities. Has the judiciary weighed in on this issue of cashless bail? And in particular, the U.S. Supreme Court, where do we stand in terms of the judiciary? Because obviously administration of justice is an issue that's near and dear to the heart of the judiciary. So where do we stand in terms of judicial review of this policy, either at the Supreme Court level or at the circuit court level?
Well, first, let me say, I don't think this is an issue that's just been around for a couple of years. The state of Illinois got rid of the private surety bail system probably over a dozen years ago, but they still had what they would call cash bail until the last year. But that was cash bonds, where they would, if a defendant was going to post a bond, they would have to post it in cash or a percentage of the bond amount in cash. And the courts then became relied upon that funds, the failure to appear, and using those funds to run operations. And so that's what the state just got rid of. As crime has increased, they decided to double down on those really bad policies. And so they got rid of the posting of cash bonds as well. And now the courts are really short of money because they were relying upon that when they failed to appear. So I think it's been around longer than a couple of years. But to answer your question directly, the courts have been very active on these issues for the last few years, and all the rulings have been against the advocates for change. And so there was an article recently in the Dallas Morning News where the advocates for change were pointing out that, they've never lost a case. Every trial court that's looked at it has ruled in their favor that bail was unconstitutional. And I wrote a letter to the editor, which we then published, saying, they just kind of forgot to mention that every court of appeals that the cases have been appealed to have reversed. So both the 11th Circuit and the 5th Circuit have ruled the private surety bail system is constitutional. The 5th Circuit has ruled the most recently and has reversed a trial court judge in Harris County like 7 or 8 times now, and it ultimately ruled that these types of suits can't even be brought in federal court anymore in the 5th District. And so both of those cases, there's probably been 3, 4, or 5 cases that have all gone to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court denied cert, and the Court of Appeals in each case reversed the trial courts that had issued rulings in favor of the plaintiffs or the advocates for change. And so I would say all of the court rulings from the appellate level have been against these advocates for change, saying that the private surety bail system is constitutional and it does not violate the use of it doesn't violate the federal constitution.
So at this point, given those appellate level decisions in the Fifth and the 11th Circuit Courts, the use of cash bail is constitutional. But of course, here in California, we are in the Ninth Circuit Court, and I didn't hear you mention the Ninth Circuit. Is there a possibility that this issue will work its way up to the Supreme Court, or are we some years away from this issue rising to that level of consideration at the Supreme Court level?
The plaintiffs in these cases, because all these cases have been filed by the same plaintiffs firm, and it is an activist group that have been funded. I mean, they raised millions of dollars just to file these lawsuits, and they keep making the same arguments even after they lose. And they don't tell the trial courts, "Oh, we've lost this argument," so they don't ever point that out. I would say that for the past 5 years, they've been trying to get a split in the circuits so they could take it to the Supreme Court.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But I think it's less and less likely that will happen now, because if you look at the spectrum of issues that they've taken to the Supreme Court, first they took the constitutionality of bail violating procedural due process. The Supreme Court wouldn't take that. Then they took the issue of whether bail was substantively constitutional, which is the big issue. Should we just get rid of it because it violates the Constitution? They refused to take that. The last 2 issues that they've taken to the Supreme Court in separate cases were not anything like that. One was an issue of mootness that the Fifth Circuit ruled on the issue of mootness incorrectly, a procedural issue. And another case they took to the Supreme Court recently was on the issue of abatement, and another procedural issue. And the U.S. Supreme Court would take either one of those. So I would say the cases that they're taking to the Supreme Court now are weaker than than the ones they were taking 5 years ago. And so I think it's less likely today that they would get a case to the Supreme Court to accept a case today than it was 5 years ago.
Mm-hmm. In the case of Texas, for instance, do you have certain jurisdictions where certain cities where cashless bail is on the books, right?
We only have one, and that's Houston, and it's because of a lawsuit. It was the very first lawsuit that was filed in O'Donnell versus Harris County, and it was appealed multiple times in reverse by the Fifth Circuit, but ultimately it was settled, and they did a settlement to agree to everything the plaintiffs wanted because they couldn't win in court. And the last ruling from the Fifth Circuit was that case has been reversed multiple times. And the court ruled it should have never been even filed in federal court. But Harris County is still following the settlement, and that only applies to misdemeanors, and they're doing simple release for misdemeanors, most misdemeanors in Harris County.
Mm-hmm. Now, of course, you live and work in Texas, and I'm here in California. But before we went on the air, we spoke briefly about the situation here in California. Could you, for the benefit of our listeners, could you give us an overview of the situation in California? Because obviously, from state to state, the regulations on cashless bail differ. Could you share with us how California looks at this issue?
Okay, well, yes, I can. So, California has been having a fight. They passed a bill through the legislature to get rid of private surety bail. And there was a proposition, or they have a procedure where you can get something on the ballot, and then it'll go before the voters to overturn what the legislature did. And so that was done. and the public voted down what the legislature passed. The problem in California is they really use a simple release mechanism system for all misdemeanors in California. So they only use the private surety bail system, where it's only available for felonies.
Right.
And on top of that, they have reclassified a lot of felonies to misdemeanors. They did that years ago in Proposition 47, where they changed certain felonies to misdemeanors, including theft under $950.
Right.
And then when our urban areas, they decided they weren't going to prosecute those crimes anymore. And that has led to, rampant shoplifting,
Right.
daily shoplifting of $25,000 a day, stores closing because they can't withstand that kind of theft. And it's really interesting when the state's saying, oh, crime's down. Well, of course it's down, because you're classifying these acts as no longer crimes because you won't prosecute them. And you've got commercial properties. I mean, look at San Francisco. We've got the Nancy Pelosi Federal Building, where they told employees it was not safe for them to come to work, and so to work from home.
Yes.
I mean, it wasn't safe for them to go park their car and walk into the building and work during the day. And now, as a result of these policies, we have the commercial properties values dropping dramatically. Property selling 30% of what they were worth 3 years ago, 50% of what they were worth 3 years ago. You've got the commercial defaults going from 5% to 40%. Right? And this is all as a result of the domino effect of these liberal policies on crime, but also when you switch to a simple release mechanism, because you can't go forward with your case. I mean, California, for their misdemeanor cases, has a speedy trial requirement, but they won't rearrest somebody if they don't show up on a misdemeanor, because all the jails are full, because they are limited on their jail space and they won't build additional jail capacity. And as a result, you've got no room at the inn. You can't hold anybody accountable. So you've got chaos for misdemeanors. Today's misdemeanors are tomorrow's felonies. And you've got crime running amok. And the really awful thing is, you've got one side of the political spectrums denying it. Oh, crime's not increasing. I mean, with the NAACP in Oakland comes out with a press release attacking their local officials, saying we need a state of emergency on crime. You can't say crime's not increasing. But you know what? We have one party that is still denying that crime is increasing in our urban areas.
Mm-hmm. Interestingly, you mentioned Prop 47. There's a ballot initiative coming up in November, which would tighten up Prop 47.
Yes, there is. They're trying. I mean, I would say they're repealing it, but they're not really repealing all of it. But I mean, if I was a voter, I would say, is this a repeal of Prop 47? And I would say, yes, I'm going to vote to repeal it.
Well, that's, again, there's a little bit of, it looks as though there is some relief coming down the road, and there seems to be strong support to do that among the voters here in California.
Well, the terrible thing was, though, the legislature was trying to do an alternative to the repealer initiative, and at the last minute they abandoned it, because even among the Democrats, they couldn't agree on what the alternative was going to be. They were going to pass an alternative to this repealer initiative, and they were going to say, well, if it got more votes than the other one, then the other one would be null and void. So they were trying to do a creative thing to blunt the repeal of Prop 47, as I refer to it. And I think they got such a backlash, they couldn't agree amongst themselves. So they've just abandoned that. And I think they've kind of just reconciled themselves that this is going to pass, even though I think all kinds of money is being thrown at trying to defeat it.
Mm-hmm. At a federal level, do you see any action in terms of criminal justice reform coming at the federal level? Is that on the cards, perhaps in the next Congress, or that's not even on the horizon?
No, I don't see any reform, maybe any criminal justice reform at the federal level. During the Trump administration, there was some Second Chance Act that passed, and I don't even think that currently that's even looked at as a positive thing that was done. I think at the time it was, but I think now it's not looked at that way. And I don't see any way that any type of reform, and you know what, now we're seeing reforms that are rolling back reforms. And, like Texas just did reform 2 years ago, 2 sessions ago, and it was the opposite of what some of these states are doing. It's strengthening the criminal justice system, not weakening it. And you're going to see more and more of that as more data comes out saying that these bad bail reform measures are the cause of increasing crime.
Well, Ken, in the remaining few minutes of the podcast, what are your closing thoughts? It sounds as though perhaps a rollback is coming down the road. What is your closing thoughts?
Well, I am very hopeful that we're going to get a better handle on our criminal justice system across the country because what we're currently doing is not sustainable. I mean, the public will demand safety, and if the government will not provide it, then we'll get vigilante justice, which is what we're getting in some of our communities, and the government won't like that. So I'm very hopeful that we're going to get a handle on this. It's going to come through rollbacks. New York enacted reforms that they've now rolled back 3 or 4 times,
Hmm.
and they're going to roll back some more. Alaska tried these reforms; they rolled them back, and we're seeing more states. I mean, we're seeing more states where they're like, this is not doing what they told us it would do.
Right.
We know how to fight crime. We know what we need to do, and they just do what they know they need to do. And these bad bail reform measures are going to continue to be rolled back as we get more data that comes down the pipes. Now, if people want more information about me or my organization, they can go to pbtx.com, which is the Professional Bondsmen of Texas. We have a blog on there on our website where we highlight important criminal justice stories in the news. But we also have our own podcast called The Bell Post. There's a link to it on our menu, but you can also just go to thebellpost.com, and we do podcasts just about criminal justice issues to educate lawmakers and the public on these arguments that are being made for reform.
Very good. Well, it sounds as though you have a number of initiatives going there, and part of the reform process is educating the public, educating the professionals, and it sounds as though you're doing that through your website and the podcast.
Yes, sir.
Well, Ken Good, I want to thank you very much for joining us. It's been very informative, and living here in California, we're looking forward to seeing some improvement in our situation here too. So once again, Ken, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me, and good luck in the upcoming election.
Okay. And for our listeners, today's episode is number 561. Listen to us on Apple Podcast, Spotify, YouTube Music, 18 platforms in total, with listeners in 60 countries. FeedSpot has recognized us as a top 25 California news podcast, ranking number 7. This has been the San Francisco Experience Podcast with Jim Herlihy, coming to you from San Francisco.